Thank you very much. Three fabulous presentations. Your opportunity to ask questions or to make other observations. We have one here.
Mahdi, thank you very much for the wonderful presentations. I have a question for Kamil. You mentioned in your presentation that after the statistics, the way they are collected right now in Iraq, they're lumping all the work categories together, مزارعين, فلاحين, and etc. And this seems to be a limitation for research across disciplines. When we did ourselves a systematic review on studies that look at the exposures, outcomes, in occupational health research, that is, of workers and etc. They also, when they used the statistics, these collected statistics, they couldn't relate exposure to outcome well because the pesticide worker or the worker in the land, the farm worker, is exposed to pesticide, and we can relate that to cancer outcomes or other diseases, while the landowner is not, the so-called farmer, if we want to coin it this way. So I was wondering, why do you think, is it for ease of data collection, they were lumping these categories together, and what is the impact of such lumping on research such as what you do, economics and other disciplines?
Well, are there some other questions? Yeah, let's take 2 or 3, and then we come back. Yeah. No.
Another to Kamil. What do statistics say about the national production of wheat since 2000? This is a major issue as it relates to what I consider the main economic crime of American occupation of Iraq, where the wheat seed stock was destroyed and then the market opened as a monopoly for Monsanto to sell Iraqi farmers wheat seed, genetically modified wheat seed that are meant not to grow into seed, thus destroying the potential for sustainability of the production of wheat and making Iraq dependent on importing wheat from outside.
Okay, so I have a question for the three of them. Actually, piggybacking on Nader's question to Kamil, the effort to become self-sufficient in wheat, I wonder about the production of the inputs. Is there a national program to be producing fertilizer and the seeds, or is that not part of the program? The question to yes. I wonder if you have in your research looked at the commission that President Sarkozy funded and supported in 2009. This was a commission headed by Amartya Sen, Jean Fatouzzi, and the other development economists. This report actually relied very extensively on a long history of feminist economics, ecological economics, and one of the conclusions of that report, I forget the full name, does anybody, the Commission on the Measurement of Social Well-Being, was that GDP is not adequate, not even to measure economic activity. So that's one question for you. The question for Max, I wonder if you have done research on el-Amami in his conversations, meetings with the other members of the delinking movement, what would you say, the Third World Movement. Is this part of a broader conversation I know you're doing a textual analysis, but is he part of a network at this time? And okay, that's it.
Thank you. That's enough for the first round. We'll come back to you. Karen. Yeah. Please. Kamil, why don't you start?
Yes. Well, Raymond, why are they editing out these differences, or why don't they recognize? Of course, I mentioned that historically this was clearly recognized. In the 70s, the government had the idea that it was going to be managing agriculture in great detail, and was going to be something more equitable in that sense, collective farms, etc., cooperatives, and so on. It didn't last terribly long in that sense, and it was actually gradually all these institutions were taken over by the rich farmers who became involved with the as power bases for the regime, and the regime was basically interested in establishing itself in the rural areas where it didn't really have a base at the time. But the fiction of this kind of that they've created some kind of model farmer in that sense was there. Soon it was recognized this wasn't the case, and the whole of this edifice was dismantled. They moved on to try to rent land in large areas, so actually dismantling the land reform, taking a lot of land out of that were distributed to peasants, was taken back and rented out to farmers in that sense. Well, why they don't, they haven't sort of recognized that in the data. Well, they never were interested in anything like that, and now it fits very well with another discourse, which is that farming as a social activity in there is useless. It's all, for example, recently the financial advisor to the Prime Minister, who's sort of the main interlocutor with the IMF, was writing about, well, what we have there is under one palm tree, several owners. So it's all fragmented and so on, and this is no way to go about farming. Of course, there was a lot of fragmentation, but there was also this, more consolidation and stability. And I think basically the idea is that pushing the ideology is of getting foreign investment, whatever that may be, to go into a new kind of agriculture to replace this useless agriculture. And for the time being, the idea of self-sufficiency continues, continues, but it's not serious. It is highly dependent on very high subsidy, which is very temporary. Sorry, with Nader, now they've actually the seed bank was robbed and destroyed. The seed production facilities were depleted under sanctions, and then gradually sort of were being revived after the loosening of sanctions a little bit. they were destroyed in 2003 again. So there is effectively very little domestic seed production, but it's, there is a considerable amount of import of seeds, and there comes in the sort of the opening and the corporations that are pushing in. I'm not sure. There's talk about producing seed domestically or improving the production of seed. There is now, under the present financial crisis, a sudden awakening that the inputs industries have been decimated and ignored, and there was a deliberate attempt deliberate work to undermine the public sector. Much of that was in the public sector, not in the private sector. So there was a deliberate attempt to run this down, to sell it off, and frequently selling it off not as a running concern. Now there is a realization that this cannot go on, but I don't think the powers that are in charge will be willing to do anything about it. So we have to
Yes. Actually, I'm not aware about the initiative you talk about from France, but there are many attempts saying the GDP is not appropriate, adequate, and theoretically, actually, it's a partial picture because it doesn't reflect the stock part of the economy at all. The concept is all about flow. Officially, the United Nations revised SNA rules probably every 10 years, and changes such as the how to deal with research and development used to be its expenses, but now investment. But I believe it's so difficult to totally deny SNA, and I even think the accounting principle SNA has become the sort of ideology itself. But what we can do is modify it, and there's a way to modify SNA for the benefit of the not only urban sector but the rural sector. That's something I believe.
Yeah, so in terms of his relationship to a broader network, I mean, first of all, dependency theory and delinking, this was the dominant paradigm for social science in Tunisia in the 70s and 80s. So basically, almost everything that, certainly everything that is still worth reading, written about Tunisia from that era is using this as the paradigm. So there's a huge amount of literature. I mean, most of it is locked up in dissertations that are only available in Tunisia, unfortunately, who have written on this, and a lot of these people were also el-Amami's collaborators. So he was definitely part of a network. They put out a book in the 80s, What Technology, What Development, that was kind of examining this question of what is the appropriate technology and for whom in Tunisia, and what kind of development would be the output, because they realized that technological dependency was kind of a major conveyor belt for the global north domination of Tunisian political economy. So there was both the networks internal to Tunisia, that it was the dominant paradigm, and then I'm sure there were also links with Arab and African delinking institutes in Dakar and Tanzania, but I haven't gotten to that point of figuring out what they were yet.
Thanks. Now there's at least one more question. Oh.
So, hi, my name is Kareem. So I have two questions. One for Kamil, because we started talking about a couple months ago, but I think we never finished, was the question of Daesh and what happened to, because I think they used wheat subsidies as one major form of actually getting to money. So there's a whole story, and I read a little bit about this, of them using wheat to actually get money from the state somehow, or using these, I don't know, they stole wheat, they forced farmers to sell wheat to them, then resold it. So that'd be kind of interesting to hear a little bit something about that and how that plays in that final gross figure in terms of how much more wheat is produced or not. And then for Max, it's really more of an observation. So one of the principal characters here in the development of kind of this hydraulic mission ideology / nationalist, semi-nationalist development is a certain guy called Raymond here in Lebanon. And I just found it quite striking how, even though he also is very much somebody who walked, for example, the whole of the Litani and you know, just to really know the river and actually knows what's going on, but then turn to completely different solutions with what's the large dams or hydropower or in that sense, and it kind of, I mean, it's really only an observation, but it illustrates how the context where you have a more progressive movement, and then you had here Lebanon being the kind of completely liberal state and completely, you know, focused on capitalist development, also brings with it these different technologies. So I think there's, you know, it's just, yeah, an observation. Okay, thanks.
Do we have any more comments? Yes.
This is a question for Kamil and the rest of the panel. How much of the dire situation of the agricultural sector in this part of the world is due to the political thinking of many modern groups that came out in the 50s and 60s and later on, to look down on agriculture vis-a-vis the industrialization of nations. We used to hear many people say that in order for your country to progress, you have to focus on industry rather than agriculture. And as you know that in the 60s and the 50s, not many people thought of agriculture as part of industry. Rather, it is a separate sector from industrialization. And many people in this part of the world look down on agriculture as a second choice in development rather than industrialization. Thank you.
We have Karen here in front, please.
Karen Raymond from the University of Kentucky. I think I maybe have the exact same question actually for Max. To what extent is el-Amami thinking of his delinking and his model of a kind of local agricultural development still based on a very modernist and productionist sensibility about agriculture, and potentially discounting a more diversified, subsistence-based, smallholder type economy. I know that in Morocco there's a sense that oasis farming and diversified production is not modern, and I'm wondering to what extent even the kind of delinking and leftist sensibility sort of subscribe to that modernist productionist model.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And one more.
It's a question for you. It's a question for Yasu or others, but since he works really in the UN agency world, I mean, to what extent is discipline kept through report writing, through the requirements within all the UN agencies to apply, you know, or not only the, but let's take the UN, okay, because that's really what you work in. Let's leave IMF and the World Bank. I mean, is there, because what you're describing is a situation where you're very unhappy, so are we all, with the devaluation of, for example, the rural sector and other things. Is there any space within these powerful agencies for people working in them and to be, you know, developing side models these days? I mean, it partly, it's a more practical question, because we don't have the autonomy of state agencies that Max is really talking about across the region in many ways. So I'm interested, you know, is there the thought of Sarko, you know, organizing something or other, which I presume, I never heard of it, I mean, died like a fizz, talk shop, I presume. But the UN agencies are big. ESCWA used to have a different kind of profile than it does now. But is there any space within those to be developing little pilots, little trials for a model that can evaluate things slightly differently? Is there
hope? It's a practical question about an organization.
Juliana at the back,
yeah, just a question for Max. My question is on the same line of the last question you were asking, you know, and it's about delinking. I mean, I was kind of surprised by the way you have used this concept, because, I mean, this is my interpretation of Samira's notion of delinking. It had a strong political imperative, right? It was, it was the idea behind the non-aligned movement in many ways. So instead, you are reframing the use of the concept, you know, bringing in the notion of agroecological research, you know, combining engineering and local knowledge, which is possibly an advancement. But then I'm kind of a bit perplexed by the way you use the notion of scarce resources. Because Samir has a huge critique of the kind of bourgeois way, you know, to see the notion of scarcity as a natural sort of thing. To Amin, it's that the notion of scarcity comes from, you know, unevenness in access to resources. So there is an issue in Samir Amin's understanding of the linking when you refer to changing internal structures of production, which is also connected to the, you know, to the different distribution of resources among different classes and groups. So I didn't see this, I mean, I see a lot of political ecology in your talk, but not enough of political economy in a sense. You know, in the sense that, you know, I can't really get, you know, a sense of how the scarcity of resources is a result of a particular set of power relations that create, you know, people that access resources in a way and people that do not access resources. So, I mean, I'm seeing the lack of this political imperative, and the issue seems very much reduced to a technical question. So, I want to see if this is my misinterpretation or if this is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we'll draw a line under your input into this session. We now come back to the panelists, and we'll go in reverse order. So, Max, please.
So, in terms of whether agriculture was neglected in terms of the political thinking, I would say in Tunisia this was mostly but not entirely the case, but I think this was also the result of the political coalition that took power after independence. So while you did have a certain element that came from the kind of medium-sized capitalist farms or small, medium family farms in the country's east, you had primarily an urban petty bourgeois in alliance with trade unions. And there was also a rural guerrilla movement, but they didn't have any political representation in, I mean, except to some extent Ben Yusuf, but not really in the post-colonial leadership. So they were unable to put forward any sort of program for rural center development, despite the fact that they did have a role in the actual confrontation with colonial power that led to independence. And So shortly afterwards, even the trade union, the UGTT, dropped its program for rural development very quickly, and subsequent rural development was entirely top-down, although it also, of course, it accommodated the large capitalist sectors. Whether or not Amami was still based on productivist or modernist principles, I don't think so. I mean, I think that may be more an effect of kind of the selective way I had to read him, because it was a short presentation, rather than what he had to say. I mean, there were, he called for research programs into cacti, camels, dates. So the kind of his work was actually, most of his work, he's most strongly identified as having focused particularly on recovering knowledge and recuperating knowledge of the indigenous hydraulics. So I would say it's more, maybe even more the opposite, that I was focusing on certain things, but he was actually focused very much so on what was indigenous to Tunisia. In terms of whether or not there's political economy, well, I don't know. I mean, I would say that this is a function of, in some ways, of how political economy is understood. I mean, there is an urban, there's been always a strong urban bias in dominant strains of Marxism, maybe less so in Samia Ramin, but I mean, I think there is still always an emphasis on industrialization, and this is kind of what the Soviet model has put upon Marxist thought post-1917 is an equation of industrialization with redistributive models of development. And that's far from the only model, and it hasn't necessarily been the most successful model. I mean, we haven't had any successful models. I mean, whether or not, I don't think that there is a possibility for development without focusing on the rural sector, and there is no democratic development of the rural sector without a strong rural political movement coming from the bottom up and coming from the most dispossessed of the rural sectors. So I think it's just a question of where I intervened in the debate, which was about the study of what kind of knowledge would be necessary theoretically for auto-centered form of development that is based on the most dispossessed of the rural sectors in any place and time. And so I don't think it's a question of a different reading of Amin. It's just kind of, I used Amin selectively to make a specific point about delinking and how it related to Dawidar and how this related to Salaheddine el-Amami's thinking. I don't know if that's satisfactory to you, but that's my answer.
Thank you.
Well, thanks. Karim, sorry, the issue about Daesh, I think I didn't mention Daesh, but it's part of the corruption in the procurement of wheat, which was suspected, and I think it's probably behind some of the delay in payment of wheat, of paying farmers in this case. It was the issue there. But in 2014, there was wheat was being delivered to silos, and well, obviously Daesh needed wheat for its own so-called state in that sense, but there is a certain amount which was probably suspected to be coming from outside, close to the border areas, and then claimed as domestic wheat, and obviously bought at lower price externally, and brought in and claimed the higher subsidized price. I don't know. I mean, it was reported. It was reported by by managers of a manager of one of the silos was suspecting that and saying it is reported it to Reuters and was. I don't think much discussion was going on about it. My feeling is that it is there. It is an issue. Now, the question of political, ideological bias against agriculture and foreign industry, well, obviously that exists. At the time, this was a major question, sort of in this way. But in practice, I don't think this was the case. For example, you would probably remember that the slogan of the Ba'ath regime in the 70s was "Al-Zira'a naftun da'im." So agriculture was as a permanent oil revenues, meaning sort of not depletable in that sense. And there was a certain amount of investment in agriculture as opposed to investment in the 50s under the development board, which was in water. That was dams and so on. Most of the funding went there, and the land was left out of it. There was actually a certain amount of focus. A number of the projects that were started earlier were taken more seriously then, but it all fizzled out. It isn't the sort of the position against agriculture as such. It's the way in which agriculture was approached, top down, managed completely, and the model, and of course the whole failure of the system in every other respect in Iraq, with the sort of the consecration of the dictatorship and the wars and so on. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of misconception that there was serious interest in agriculture before, before the land reform, and that the land reform destroyed agriculture. My view is completely against that, and I have I've sort of I don't want to go into it now, but I think the feeling that, well, Iraq used to export grain, and then after land reform started importing grain. Well, the cause was land reform. Well, there's a big issue about that, and I don't accept it in that sense. Thanks.
But Dr. Tawaji's question, I don't have the knowledge about the history of agricultural development in this region, but what I reckon is as opposed to Eastern Asia, where the rural sector is sort of the basis of the development, and then there's rural-urban migration and resource movement, and then, yes, agriculture is sort of decreased and at the cost of the industrialization. But my short experience in this region pointed to the when industry goes down, agriculture goes down as well. So this is actually a bit of a part. I'm confused really why I don't see a clear picture of the sort of industrialization at the cost of the decline of agricultural sector, in my knowledge. And as the master's question, we are obliged to use the official statistics from National Statistical Office that is the decision from our statistical committee, which is part of the technical committee of the SQA. So we are very careful about when we talk about data, actually. But as to the doing something new, well, if it is technically feasible, this is a time to explore opportunities, possibilities, because as we all know that the UN advocate the new development goals as sustainable SDGs, sustainable development goals. As the name implies, it's all about the sustainability. That includes, yes, environment and the land, quality of land, sustainability in agriculture. So I think this is a time to propose new idea for the accounting system or statistical system now so dominating the discourse of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could I remind everybody that there is a final session tomorrow, which is to explore the issue of agendas, action, which is of course a wonderful word, and building networks. And I do hope people, this doesn't sound too arrogant, but I do hope people are making some notes about what it is that they think has either been missing from this workshop, and what it is that they think might be more effectively pursued further in ongoing research, either by members here, colleagues here, or elsewhere, because it does seem to me it would be a terrible missed opportunity if the value of what's happening over these 3 days just simply evaporates in a post-coffee break milieu, which probably leads half a dozen people here rather than 30 or 40. So I do encourage you to gird your loins for more stamina tomorrow. In relation to this, it's incredibly frustrating being a chair of a session, you know that, because there are several things that I won't repeat here, but there are already 3 kind of big blocks of things, it seems to me, that can emerge tomorrow. One is this whole issue of bloody data. Phil Rakes, the late Phil Rakes, wrote a book called Modernizing Hunger in the 1980s. It is still the most fabulous analysis of how, where, and when, and under what kind of social conditions famine emerges. And Phil Rakes argued, and I see no evidence to suggest these figures are now in doubt. He argued in the 80s that you could not get more accurate figures on rural production to within plus or minus 20%. Just reflect on that, plus or minus 20% in terms of accurate accounting mechanisms for rural production. Now, where the hell is it going, and why does he make that kind of assertion? Crucial to this wonderful attempt to bring in the debate about delinking is Samir Amin's ultimate concern, which isn't about kind of development and industrial. Of course, it's all that, and it's the pox on imperialism, which he's a main driving force still in his old age. He's like a mountain goat. He's still producing volumes every fortnight. But fundamental to what Samir Amin drives is the idea of boosting rural incomes. And as Yasu, in a sense, intimates, boosting rural income is not rocket science, because if you boost rural incomes, you boost effective demand. And in so doing, you boost the size of your economy, no matter how you want to measure it. So development, broadly conceived, can be very easily promoted, and not in any massively radical way, by boosting rural incomes. And there are political objections to so doing. And it does seem to me that therein lies the importance of having a political economy, characterization and understanding of what the political constituency is necessary to have to promote the kind of strategy that Max has began to unfold. Because that's fundamental to Samir Amin's idea of delinking. You have to have a political constituency that put in place policies that's going to support and enrich, and in so doing promote national development, but first and foremost rural development. Because without rural development and surplus extraction from the countryside, whatever happens to that surplus when it's produced is of course another political issue. But you have to have rural surplus production first and foremost. And that, it seems to me, is wherein some of the debates upcoming about alternative development strategies must be more firmly grounded. Lunch.
Thank you very much. Can I just make an announcement? Not to trivialize what Ray just said, but we do need a photo
For our website, so of the meeting. So if we can line up on the stairs and we can take a photo, a group photo of all the participants, and then we can upload it on our website. Okay. That and the closing session, of course, that Ray mentioned.
Are we starting at 1:30 or at 2?
Okay. We are late on the program, so
prior to overrunning this session by almost 15 minutes, we were going to have a delayed lunch up until 1:30. But perhaps we should now say, with the authority of this chair, 1:40 to return.
1:45? No, so we have 5 minutes for the photo.
Okay, 5 minutes.
5 minutes? No, I mean, you know,
Fascinating.
to line up and all.